Hello, everyone. My name is Claudia Matos Abolese. I'm a professor for the history of art at the University of Campinas and one of the organizers of the next CIHA World Congress Migrations, which will take place next August in São Paulo, Brazil. In the name of the CIHA Organization Committee, today I want to welcome you to the CIHA Pre-Congress series, Art Worlds of Brazil, a program of 10 lectures created in collaboration with the Clark Art Institute to offer a comprehensive view of the rich and diverse art traditions of Brazil from the colonial period to contemporary art. Art Worlds of Brazil will offer an introduction to the main collections, historical sites, and artworks in the country, critically examined by local art historians specialized in different aspects of Brazilian visual culture. The lectures will be posted once a month for public access on the Clark and CIHA websites, and a closed webinar related to each lecture will be offered to the participants of CIHA World Congress in the week after the posting of each lecture. Whether you will take part in the CIHA World Congress in São Paulo next year or not, we hope that this program will encourage everyone to actively engage with the richness of the visual culture in Brazil and get to know a little more about the scholarship produced by local art historians on this material. Hélio Menezes is a curator and anthropologist. He works as curator for contemporary art at the São Paulo Cultural Center and was one of the curators for the exhibition Afro-Atlantic Histories. Let's welcome Hélio Menezes.
Hello, my name is Hélio Menezes, and this is the pre-recorded lecture on Afro-Brazilian contemporary art circuits in Brazil, which I was invited to elaborate as part of the research and academic program of the Clark Art Institute in March 2021. I would like to thank the Institute for the invitation and everyone for listening. I hope the short presentation will help provoke interesting and urgent debates. The title of this lecture reflects in itself two key concepts that must and will be analyzed under critical perspectives today. The first is the very idea of what we understand as Afro-Brazilian art and the misunderstandings around this notion that must be clarified. The other, provoked by this program, is what we can effectively call circuit, and how we could characterize the current challenges for the Afro-Brazilian contemporary art circuits then. I would like to begin this presentation with this watercolor self-portrait by Sidney Amaral, entitled Naklish, or Who Will Speak in Our Behalf, from 2014. I think it's important to immediately address the question of why or what does it mean for a contemporary free man to depict himself as wearing such notorious torture instrument against the body of enslaved people with microphones instead of the original hooks. This question and this work, I think they synthesize a number of arguments I will articulate in this lecture about what Afro-Brazilian art can signify. Because this title, Who Shall Speak on Our Behalf, brings us to the historic constitution of the notion of Afro-Brazilian art during the last century in Brazil. Because for decades, this term has been understood and classified by many non-Afro-Brazilian artists and scholars, mainly around the theme or the motives or the content of Black experience, reducing the infinitely diverse field of two categories insistently related to religious, popular, naive, and to subjects restricted to generic ideas of Blackness. It is more recently that we were able to finally address the question of authorship and attempt to resignify and political operate the concept of Afro-Brazilian art under these terms. Having been confronted by definitions of this notion that has distorted, erased, and whitewashed Afro-Brazilian artistic production for many decades. It's fundamental we reestablish not only in discourse, but in practice, that this notion, even if not a consensual concept amongst Black scholars, is not about motives, but about Black authorship and subjectivities producing art in their own terms. However, the fundamental point is that this term or concept can never serve to circumscribe or delimitate Afro-Brazilian artists' productions in terms of their highly diversified visual expressions, motifs, themes, aesthetics, mediums, or supports. Maybe it's time to talk about Afro-Brazilian artists, plural, rather than Afro-Brazilian art, so singular. Another interesting issue that the self-portrait invites us to discuss is the very idea of circuit. Because when we think of circulation, it doesn't fit into an Afro and only Brazilian perspective. As I see it, it is necessary to enlarge the idea of nationality, adopting an Afro-Atlantic perspective in which an intense dialogue is being developed for decades, even centuries, if not directly, through indirect shared use of iconography, aesthetical references, and theoretical concepts amongst artists, curators, and thinkers of the African diaspora. As Sidney Amaral, many other artists of African descent has been rereading images of colonial violence on the present issues it still produces, although in their forms, not only overlapping temporalities, but also cultural elements, as if they invited silenced voices from the past to express themselves in the present, this time not as objects, but as owners of their own voices and narratives. This referential dialogue or circuits becomes clear when we see works like this installation by African-American artist Hank Willis Thomas, whose title is precisely What Goes Without Saying, from 2012. At the same time, they are both addressing the issue of authorship and self-definition, the conditions in which people of African descent are allowed to express themselves. What also interests me here is how these works confronted, coming from different backgrounds, reveal an emerging circuit or circulation of visual and tactual conventions. This is not an isolated case, but rather the contrary. Nor is it specific to the artistic field, finding resonances in the whole culture, but perhaps it's there that it has become more clearly obvious. To illustrate this further, I brought some other examples of shared references, especially but not only, using colonial iconography in resignified contemporary contexts. As these two works by Rosana Paulino from Brazil and Titus Kaffar from the US, both rereading in their own ways this violent image on the left, a photograph taken by 19th century German-born Brazilian resident photographer Jorge Henrique Paff. From the drawing depicting the coronation of Jean-Jacques Dessalines, Haiti's first Black emperor, we can find one of the strongest conventions of representation, which we also see in this portrait of Rio Newton, attributed to Blair Stepp, and in this beautiful picture of the Sisterhood of the Blessed Mother of Good Death by the photographer Adenor Gondim. In the three cases, separated by time and geography, Black leaders are portrayed seated as kings and queens. The reference to the Black Atlantics choose a known concept coined by Paul Gilroy, as the main territory of reference, more than the national boundaries, is also a key point that connects a great variety of artists of African descent, as illustrated by those three works, also separated in time and space, although very connected by their shared references, sometimes without intention. Well, this all to say that the intensity and diversity of these artistic exchanges was precisely the conceptual base for what became the show Afro-Atlantic Histories, which I was honored to integrate the curatorial team in 2018. This show aimed at complexifying our understanding on how and how far Black Atlantic was fundamental for the constituency of arts and cultures in the Black experience all over the Americas. This view of the installation show works of Hank Willis Thomas and Emanuel Araújo. In the next slide, we will see another view of the exhibition that shows some works by Dalton Paula, Jaime Laureano, Jorge Valris, Abdias Nascimento, and Alphonse Emadje, artists from Brazil, Haiti, and Benin that has also a closer dialogue and reciprocal influences. This exhibition also was on the front page of the New York Times, one of the first experiences in Brazil of what we call also the circulation of ideas, this time not from the north to the south, but rather from the south towards the north. One founding and fundamental figure to understand this debate, to resignify the very idea of Afro-Brazilian art, is Abdias Nascimento, Brazil's first Black senator, teacher, intellectual, and artist. Abdias was exiled in Buffalo, New York in the 70s during Brazil's military dictatorship, where he began painting intensely. In this slide, we see two of his works in strong dialogue depicting reinterpretations of both the Brazilian flag on the left, and the United States flag on the right. In common, the paintings show both flags in vertical forms and reconfigured under Yoruba symbolism. For the Brazilian flag, he has introduced the red arrow and replaced the positivist and French-inspired motto, order and progress, by OK, in reference to this very strongly revered deity in East Africa and in Brazil, Oxóssi. For the US flag, Nascimento merges the ultimate symbol of Shango, another important African god, over the national flag, expanding North America's patriotic sense to an Afro-Atlantic axis. Nascimento was also responsible for the creation of the first Black Arts Museum in Brazil in the 50s, harboring an important collection of Afro-Brazilian artists along with non-Afro-Brazilian agents of culture. The context of racial-motivated political persecution and structural racism, this museum was never able to have its own official headquarters. It's a good example of the Afro-Brazilian struggle for decades to have its own space of expression. But before the 60s and the 70s, it's important to say that some occasions, as far as the first Afro-Brazilian Congress in 1934, that included, what I believe from my research, the very first exhibition on Afro-Brazilian art organized in Brazil. This exhibition associated the notion of Afro-Brazilian art only as an expression of the popular and religious fields, not even recognizing the individual authorship of the exhibited works. These ideas have also been echoed in more mainstream initiatives, still groundbreaking for the status quo of the time, such as the series of exhibitions organized by the Italo-Brazilian architect Lina Bobardi in the 50s and the 60s. Back to the 60s and 70s, when Abdias Nascimento was articulating his visions and breaking with this colonial definition of Afro-Brazilian art as just a cultural field, there were two very significant moments in the circuit that must be highlighted. I refer to the First World Festival of Black Arts in Dakar, 1966, and the second edition in 1977, this time in Lagos, Nigeria, when many Afro-Brazilian artists, such as Heitor dos Prazeres, got in contact with artists from all over African continent and the diaspora, creating new exchanges and reinforcing the circulation of conventions and references that echoes until today with great impact on the development of Afro-Brazilian arts and culture. In the same time, in the same period and context, the Museu Afro-Brasileiro was created in Salvador in the end of the 70s. In the next slide, you're going to see some images related to this museum, which has become an important point in the circuit, but also bringing a series of contradictions, as the fact of being created and directed by photographer Pierre Berger and artist-curator Caribé, who were neither Afro nor Brazilian, despite of the name, location, and intentions of the institution. It's also important to highlight the local contexts when these initiatives were held. In the late 70s, Black movements began reorganizing in several fields, including from exile under the Brazilian military dictatorship. They were fighting on both ethical and aesthetical fronts, inspired by notions of Black power and Black is beautiful, and by dialogues and networks based on the notions of negritude and the Pan-Africanism. Exemplifying this wave of Africanization of social and political organizations through artistic and cultural manifestations, we have Carlos Vergara's famous photograph taken in Rio de Janeiro's Carnival in 1972, on the left, And on the right, you can see another symbolic image of Carnival in 1978 in Salvador with the Bloco Afro Ileaie. Circling back to the ancestral circulation or circuit I have been exemplifying, another important opportunity is the work of J. Cunha, which maintains strong ties to exchanges and research between the Atlantic coasts of Brazil and Africa. Responsible for creating the visual identity of Brazil's first Bloco Afro, called Ileaie, whose headquarters in the periphery of Salvador still functions as a nodular space for our conversation and on circuits and their institutionalization. We can see how the artists help to visually connect shared conventions and traditions across cultural expressions, with the clear dialogue between J. Cunha and Ileaie with Black textile art traditions, such as this one by Alphonse Madje, for example, from Benin, on the left, and Faith Ringgold from the US, on the right. The context of the 80s in Brazil was marked by waves of social rearticulation and emerging movements that politically reclaimed reparations and rights, Blacks and indigenous population, for Black and indigenous populations, which gained even more national attention and relevance in the public and cultural agendas with the democratic process in the late 80s. This is exemplified here by two very symbolic photographs. The march of the 100-year anniversary of the so-called slavery abolition in Brazil on the left, and the historical speech performance by indigenous leader Ailton Krenak during the National Constituent Assembly, during which he painted his face in black paint. In this new political context, the idea of Afro-Brazilian art and its circuits go through another fundamental moment, this time institutionally successful, when the artist and curator Emanuel Araújo makes public his broad and methodical research named the Afro-Brazilian Hand, articulating Afro-Brazilian artists from the 18th century through the 21st century. The research unfolded as a series of exhibitions through the 90s that definitely established a new baseline and understandings of that notion we are discussing, the very notion of Afro-Brazilian contemporary art, revealing the influence of Black artists from the Baroque to contemporary art, and culminating with the creation of the Museu Afro Brasil in 2004. The successful and ongoing experience with Museu Afro Brasil opened up a more fertile field for new Afro-Brazilian exhibitions, expressions, and narratives to emerge, especially in the last 15 years. Besides, the Afro-Atlantic Histories exhibition, which we have already mentioned in 2018, I brought to you a few examples, such as, in the next slides, some images of the exhibition Territories at Pinacoteca of São Paulo, Brazil's oldest art museum in 2016, as well as Diálogos Ausentes, Absent Dialogues in Itaú Cultural, curated by Gianni Lima, also in São Paulo in 2016. We can also mention the exhibition The Color of Brazil in Museu de Arte do Rio de Janeiro in 2016, curated by Paulo Eckenhoff and Marcelo Campos. The exhibition Now We Are All Black, Agora Somos Todos Negros, realized at Galpão Video Brasil in 2017, curated by Daniel Lima. And also to mention the Valongo Festival, Valongo International Festival of Image in Santos in 2018 and 2019, also created by Gianni Lima. I would also like to mention, because it has contributed to my reflections on what we are now calling circuit, the public exhibition I curated during the pandemic crisis last year, called Voices Against Racism. This exhibition was particularly interesting because it not only showcased works of 31 Black and Indigenous artists in multiple ways of expressing their arts and researches, but also did so in 40 different places around the city of São Paulo, including and especially in its periphery. Site-specific, street-related mediums, such as posters and graffiti, video projection, and open space interventions were created to allow for the exhibition to happen with the necessary precautions during the pandemic. Although the field for exhibitions and temporary programs by and for Afro-Brazilian artists, curators, and other agents has been flourishing in the last decades, we are still far from institutionalization and equal representation in art institutions in the art world more broadly. An important and recent research conducted by Luciara Ribeiro has put in numbers the continuous institutional domination by white and usually male professionals, showing that even though there are more Black and Indigenous curators, only 20% of them work inside institutions regularly. In this sense, the challenge is to transcend the circuits that still depend on individuals, and thus vulnerable and mortal, their efforts and trajectories in order to create and sustain institutionalized spaces, programs, opportunities, and narratives that can actually sustain adequate representation in its unfolding. Despite this scenario, I would like to present some of the movements made by public program institutions, as well as some of the independent institutions created and maintained by Afro-Brazilian thinkers in recent years. I am referring as the importance presence of the curator Keina Eleison as creative director of the Museum of Modern Art in Rio de Janeiro, the presence of curator Marcelo Campos leading the Rio de Janeiro's Museum of Art, the presence of Igor Simões and Fabiana Lopes as the curatorial team of the last Bienal do Mercosul. Another example I can speak about personally is my position as contemporary art curator at the São Paulo Cultural Center. My work there has been dedicated to developing annual programs and specific exhibitions centered around a diversified presence of artists and artistic languages, especially those of dissident, Black, Indigenous, and queer authorships. The next slides will show some images of those recent exhibitions, such as Open Paths and Mostra 2020. Other very important initiatives that nowadays constitute what we can call as a new emerging circuit of Afro-Brazilian arts created and conducted by Afro-Brazilians are the group Nacional Trovoa, a group of Black, Indigenous, and non-white women artists that have nodules across Brazil. Aparelha Luzia, a space of arts and sociability by and for Black people, conducted by artist and politician Érica Malunguinho, as well as Acervo da Laje and Galpão Bela Maré, both spaces of fostering and circulation of Afro-Brazilian artists, especially for those at the peripheries of Salvador and Rio de Janeiro cities. After this resumed panorama on Afro-Brazilian contemporary art circuits, I'd like to finish this lecture with this work by Frente 3 de Fevereiro, an anti-racist collective of artists based in São Paulo. Back in 2018, I invited this group to intervene over the facade of MASP and Instituto Tomiotaki, two important museums located in the most rich and white areas of São Paulo. At that time, the question written with Black font, with Black lettering over the white flag, as today, addresses maybe the most urgent question around the issue we have discussed today. Where are the Blacks in the Afro-Brazilian contemporary art circuits in Brazil today? And why aren't we at the most powerful decision-making places that are still dominated by people that are not Afro-Brazilian at all? Thank you.